As South Africa counts the cost of what has allegedly been termed the biggest corruption scandal this country has ever seen in a democracy, the credibility of the state is at stake in the eyes of both its citizens and the world, as the Cereti Arms Commission's ability to uncover the truth is being questioned. While this is happening, the country is once again in the process of reviewing its current defense capacity, and this time it is expected that many more billions will be spent in securing new ammunitions.
It's the secrecy in the arms deal, it's the growing culture of secrecy in our society that effectively enabled the corruption.
By the time it is built, which would take at least 20 years, maybe longer, would cost approximately double what we're spending at the moment.
But when these military capacities now have to be shared with the rest of the continent, 54 countries, then it means that we would need to increase it.
It is life-threatening combat situations like these in Bangui, Central African Republic, that led to a confrontation between South African peacekeeping soldiers and Seleka rebels in March 2013. In the end, 13 South African National Defence Force soldiers died and 27 were injured. When the corpses of the fallen were brought back home, the country celebrated their bravery. But later on, reports emerged that it seems South African troops were made more vulnerable by the lack of air support and resources required in a conflict situation such as this. The need for ammunition for an emerging country such as ours has since the dawn of our democracy been an issue of serious contestation, with some believing that the country has more pressing social needs to spend its resources on than procuring arms. It's 1300 hours at the Lohatla Army Combat Training Centre in the Northern Cape. The South African National Defence Force has organised a firepower demonstration, and Special Assignment went along to gauge the current military capacity of our ground troops. The aim of this exercise is to showcase the combat readiness of our troops that will soon be deployed to various countries in Africa to help resolve conflicts before they escalate to massively destructive levels. Defence officials are hard at work to improve the image of the Defence Force amid negative reports about the status of the country's military. Among them is Captain Zukisani Buyana, who is in eager expectation of military action.
This is the immediate reaction force, which anything that comes possible in terms of crisis in Africa, we are ready. We are ready for that. We have done the training, and we are confident that we can do anything, any job that is we are required to do with regard to a crisis in Africa.
Captain Buyana has been previously deployed to peacekeeping operations in Burundi, the DRC, as well as Sudan. But this time around, things may be different.
They may differ a bit to this one, because now this one is an improved operation, I will say, to the operation that we're doing on the Peace Mission Force. This one is an improved one, whereby now we have polished on our deployments, and I may say that we are a bit aggressive.
Captain Buyana is part of a combat group of South African troops that will soon be deployed to the African capacity for immediate response to crises. Initially, the Defence Review anticipated that South Africa would deploy to only 2 or 3 countries in the continent. But due to an increase in instability in certain regions, these deployments have increased substantially. South Africa has recently announced its intention to deploy 1,500 military personnel into Africa. And with the increase in terrorism and instability in parts of the continent, it seems the country's involvement in such conflicts is being stepped up. But concerns have been raised about the unintended consequences of such interventions, which might put the country directly against extremist groups. The Defence Force believes that these interventions are unavoidable.
We have been involved in peacekeeping operation for a period of over 10 years. And initially we were involved just in peacekeeping operation, where there's a measure of agreement amongst the belligerents in terms of establishing peace, and therefore the force will be there to facilitate that process. But more and more we're being called to get engaged in peace enforcement, as has been the case in the DRC. And of course, the difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement is that with peace enforcement, you are actually engaged in what you can say limited war, because if some belligerents don't want to comply, you have to force them militarily to comply.
Increasingly, the moral and political debates about involvement in such conflicts, even under the banner of the African Union, remain. What it also means is that more resources are now being sought, as seen with the recent tabling of the Defence Review of 2014 in Cabinet. But with so much controversy associated with the previous arms deal, does this raise another concern of a potential scandal? In 1999, the South African government signed contracts totaling 30 billion rands to modernize its defense equipment, which included the purchase of frigates, submarines, light utility helicopters, lead-in fighter trainers, and advanced light fighter aircraft. It involved companies from Sweden, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and it is alleged that up to 1.1 billion rands in bribes were paid to secure the deal. Ironically, a few months before the procurement of the first arms deal, an affordability study was conducted in August 1999 to determine whether the country could proceed with the strategic defense packages. And activist Terry Crawford Brown, who has for a long time called for an investigation into the alleged corruption, says that the study provided the warnings which were not heeded.
The warnings are there in the affordability study that went to the Cabinet in August 1999. They warned about the foreign exchange risks. They warned that instead of creating jobs, we'd lose jobs. They warned that this would crowd out government expenditure and other priorities. They warned that the offsets were, there was a cloud over offsets, that they were internationally discredited. All of those warnings were just brushed off.
The Defence Review 1996 to 1998 preceded the Strategic Defence Package, which was a military procurement deal valued at up to 30 billion rands. 4 frigates, 3 submarines, 24 Hawk fighter planes, 28 Gripens, and 30 helicopters were purchased in 1999 to upgrade the South African Navy and Air Force capacity. Unfortunately, this arms deal has been shrouded in controversy, with numerous allegations of corruption by whistleblowers who have since been subpoenaed to the Arms Procurement Commission. But where did it all start? In September 1999, the then Member of Parliament, Patricia de Lille, shocked the country when she called for an inquiry on what she referred to as large-scale corruption associated with the deal.
The government.
We are also opposed.
I received a briefing and a report from concerned ANC members of Parliament. The report contains various allegations involving very senior people, involving big amounts of money and also bribery and corruption. I thought the best way to deal with it was to go to Parliament and call for a motion requesting a judicial commission of inquiry to further investigate all the allegations.
Terry Crawford Brown called for a commission of inquiry since the late 1990s and even took President Jacob Zuma to the Constitutional Court, which indirectly led to the formation of the Cereti Commission in September 2011. 3 years later, the Commission of Inquiry led by Judge Cereti continues to be dogged by negative reports alleging attempts to uncover the truth are being thwarted. Key members of the previous government, such as former President Thabo Mbeki and the Minister of Trade and Industry Alec Irwin, testified. Their view is that the deal was necessary and that its processes were above board. In the mix, Patricia de Lille's motive when she released the so-called de Lille dossier were questioned.
And in any event, you have already indicated to the Commission that you did not submit this information to President Mbeki, then President Mbeki. But didn't you think that if you were to do this, he might have appointed a commission of inquiry?
When you're a member of parliament, you have to work within the rules of parliament. And what I did on the 9th of September was to go to parliament and call for a judicial commission of inquiry. So that's on the record of parliament. And so the president was part of parliament. He came to parliament quite often to answer questions. We had a leader of government business in parliament, Honorable Jacob Zuma. And they had to take that request to President Mbeki, and then President Mbeki could have then said, but give me more information so I can establish a judicial commission of inquiry. And so that is the procedure that had to be followed.
Then it was Gavin Woods, the former chairperson of the Standing Committee of Public Accounts, who was in charge of the committee when the corruption allegations surfaced. He was criticized for his testimony's failure to provide concrete evidence.
Scenario that you have given in paragraph 85, you are making drawing certain inferences which brought you to a position where you say that public officials and or senior politicians were bribed. You do not have direct evidence which indicates to that.
This is just my deductions that I make, which I take full responsibility for, which I don't state as inconclusive or as absolute fact. But these are my deductions as the way I summarize my evidence. And of course, I'm hopeful that you will summarize it and see it in the same way.
And the man behind the Constitutional Court action that forced the formation of the commission provided an even more bizarre account in his testimony.
Mr. Hani was on the verge of exposing Mr. Modise's involvement in corruption relating to the arms deal when he was assassinated in April 1993. It has been alleged that Mr. Yanis Wallish was ultimately employed by BAE, perhaps by way of John Breedenkamp, the Rhodesian Zimbabwean who was the second largest recipient of those BAE bribes.
40 civil society groups have called for the disbandment of the Arms Procurement Commission. Researcher and co-author of the book The Devil's in the Detail, Henny van Vuren, is less confident that the Arms Commission will yield any significant results.
It's clear that the Commission is not interested in any help from outside parties. It's evident that the Commission is acting in an unfair manner. We've come to the conclusion that the only way that we will get to the bottom of this deal is to shut down the Cereti Commission of Inquiry, disband it. We've spent hundreds of millions of rands on a commission that's produced almost no new evidence and has no interest in evidence that we and many others can produce.
Van Vuren, along with other whistleblowers, are calling for an independent prosecution authority to investigate the deal and to charge all those that will be found guilty of corruption. However, the Arms Procurement Commission believes that these criticisms are baseless.
It's an unfounded allegation in the sense that that allegation is made by some of the people that have requested certain documentations from the commission, documentation of which as a commission are the document that we need to do the investigation on this. So some of the people have requested documentation to do actually a parallel process of what as a commission we are doing. And as a commission we're being able to say to them that we cannot do a parallel investigation. We as a commission are in possession of this documentation to assist us to approach some of you in order to get to the bottom of this.
The withdrawal of key evidence leaders is a source of concern to the public. Why has this happened?
The two evidence leaders that have resigned, I think it's a source of a pain to us as a commission because they were playing quite an important role as far as the information is concerned. And also after going through the issues that were issues of discomfort to them, we realized that if they could have raised these issues earlier,
the Commission would have answered adequately the issues that they have raised. So, unfortunately, what happened was that they raised those issues in their resignation letters.
Since January 2013, there have been at least 6 senior resignations from the Commission, of which 4 were in protest against the Commission's alleged conduct, including interference. In August 2014, 2 senior evidence leaders also resigned from the Commission.
Overwhelmingly, there is a sense from many civil society organizations who have said that enough is enough. There's a huge amount of money, 70 billion rand was spent on weapons at the cost of jobs, at the cost of houses, at the cost of education, and at the cost of opportunity for ordinary people in South Africa. And fundamentally, people must be held to account for this injustice. Those people who decided that we need to buy weapons, those people who bribed our politicians to sell those weapons must be held to account.
The Commission is set to conclude its investigations in November 2014, but given all the concerns, it is not clear whether its findings will eventually lift the lid on what really happened. Are these developments over the past 15 years any indication of what could happen with the second review of South Africa's defence capabilities? The global arms market is worth billions, and in the past, these deals have experienced a high probability of corruption. The Africa Aerospace and Defence Expo 2014 showcases some of the latest military technology available to South Africa, as well as other international players. It seems that only a few countries are immune to corruption with regards to arms deals. A 2014 report of Transparency International revealed that South Africa, along with Kenya, India and Bosnia, have an 18% potential for corruption with regards to arms procurement. In March this year, Minister of Defence Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula announced the next defence review for 2014. She says it is aimed at addressing a steady decline of the National Defence Force. International relations expert Sipamandla Zondi believes that the geopolitical situation on the continent warrants this expenditure.
It is very worrying when you hear that South Africa's military capacity is declining when its military capacity is going to be needed for the continent. Because you need to notice this, South Africa's military capacity as national capacity for national security is probably more than adequate. Perhaps we should be object to it being expanded. But when this military capacities now have to be shared with the rest of the continent, 54 countries, then it means that we would need to increase it. Because now we're not thinking nationally, we're thinking continentally. And for that reason, we need to boost it. Because if we don't do it, we will be blamed for military takeovers, for rebels running over governments all over the continent. We have got to prevent that because we can't say it's happening out there. Because if we allow it to happen in Malawi, allow it to happen in Kenya, allow it to happen in Equatorial Guinea, in no time it will reach us too.
Military analyst Helmut Heidmann is a former member of the Defence Review Committee. He says South Africa's arms expenditure should be 2% of the country's gross domestic product.
The Defence Force envisaged by the Defence Review, by the time it is built, which would take at least 20 years, maybe longer, would cost approximately double what we're spending at the moment. And if you go much below that, then you can no longer do the regional stuff. So talking from 1.1% of GDP, if you do your build-up over 20 plus 20 to 30 years, we stop just short of 2% of GDP. So at the moment we're spending, 42 billion or so, so it'll be about 80. If you want to do it in less time, then obviously you're going to spend more upfront because you're buying more equipment in a shorter period of time. But overall, about 2% of GDP would do the job, which means roughly 80 billion a year in today money.
Speaking on the sidelines of the Africa Aerospace and Defence Expo 2014, Minister Nqakula said the Defence Review is about reversing the previous budget cuts which have led to the current state of the Defence Force.
20 years later, Defence Review says those cuts have severely affected the functioning of the Defence Force, its capabilities and so on, in particular the landward forces, which is the army. When that process is completed in Parliament, it will then give us an opportunity to then implement the way we have planned things, and much of that will be dealing with, of course, procurement of the required capabilities which we need.
But what lessons can be learned to avoid a repetition of the current controversy? Although the Commission's investigation is yet to be concluded, Wood's testimony at the Commission provided a glimpse into what could have been fundamentally wrong with the previous arms deal.
If there is sufficient circumstantial evidence, if it corroborates, and if it produces lucid explanations of what probably happened, and in the case I presented, I believe it's very compelling that the probability of corruption in the previous arms deal is very, very high.
He believes that international best practice on procurement processes were not followed, and this made it possible for the corruption to occur. In particular, he pointed to the introduction of numerous subcommittees, which further complicated the reporting lines and accountability.
Also, we noticed that at the evaluation stage there were some very powerful individuals, one in particular, who engineered many changes into the evaluation and specification processes, who produced the recommendations. This individual, did all the presentations up through the other structures, all the way through the other committees to the Cabinet Subcommittee.
He identified this individual as Chippy Sheikh, who was then leading the acquisitions for the Department of Defence. Chippy Sheikh is scheduled to appear before the Commission in November this year, and had this to say in his defence upon his resignation from the department in 2002.
We ran the acquisition program in the most transparent, most accountable fashion. Bear in mind, prior to 94, armaments was procured totally differently. It was more in a closed door environment, clandestine type of operation, where only one department had a say in acquisition-related matters relating to defense. In this particular program, we ensured that there's a great accountability. We brought in Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Public Enterprise, we brought in the Cabinet, we brought in DTI, and other government departments as well to play a role. Department of Finance played a major role in it. So I think in terms of accountability under defense as a national security establishment, we did the best we could.
Activists believe that another pitfall was that the previous arms deal was shrouded in too much secrecy.
If we need those weapons, firstly, I think that would be the first question. I think then there needs to be an environment in which this takes place. And one is that Parliament is fully consulted and it finally approves the deal, which didn't happen in the first arms deal. That there is a minimum amount of secrecy involved in the process. It's the secrecy in the arms deal, it's the growing culture of secrecy in our society that effectively enabled the corruption. And I do not believe that at the moment we as the public can be given the guarantee that our politicians are going to ensure that there isn't secrecy in this process. The argument always is that this is an issue of national security and national importance. I think that we must demand the highest levels of transparency.
In addition to transparency, there is a need to protect state processes from political interference.
That we need to communicate a little bit more. The second thing, we need to know the players that are involved a little bit more. We need to do a lot more vetting of officials that are involved in these processes. And you need, thirdly, to ensure that politicians have to make sure that they step back as far as possible, at least to avoid an impression, to avoid creating an impression that you want to have your finger in the pie. Because for politicians, in the political environment, it is not matters of facts, it is not matters of being caught on it, but it is suspicions, it is impression you make. So politicians, to the extent possible, have to make the impression that they are as distant from this as possible and that the technical people are handling the things.
It seems sometimes impressions are enough to create a reality which may or may not exist. Experts say the responsibility of the state is to ensure that the country is taken into its confidence so that positive impressions of a corruption-free process may be created.